Yn gyntaf, diolch yn fawr iawn i chi am ddod yma heddiw. Mae'n braf iawn bod cymaint o bobl yma. Dyma'r cyntaf gobeithio nifer y sesiynau da ni'n mynd i gynnal rhwng Gwasanaeth Ymchwil a Cynulliad ac Canolfan Llywodraethiant Cymru ar faterion cymysliadol y bwys. Heddiw fyddwn ni'n mynd i sôn yn amlwg am referendwm ar annibyniaeth yr Alban fydd yn cymryd lle mis Medi flwyddyn nesaf. Ac jyst i roed amlinelliad cyflym o'r strwythur y sesiwn heddiw, fyddai'n sôn am y cyd-destun cyfansoddiadol am ryw 10 munud a wedyn pasio ymlaen at yr athro James Mitchell bydd yn sôn chydig bach mwy am y dehongliad o ran obligiadau y referendwm ac materion sy'n digwydd yn yr Alban ar hyn o bryd. Gai hefyd gymryd y cyfle i groesawu James yma. Mae'r athro James Mitchell yn arbenigwr blaenllaw o'r faterion gwleidyddol yn yr Alban. Ac oherwydd hynny bod mae'n ddyn prysur ofnadwy ar hyn o bryd. Ac felly mae'n bleser i gael o lawr efo ni ac byddwn ni'n diolchgar iawn iddo fo am gymryd amser allan o'i schedule i fod efo ni. O ran be fyddai'n sôn amdano fo heddiw, jyst yn gyflym yn sôn am y cyd-destun, felly y pwerau gafodd ei datganoli yr Alban drwy ddeddf yr Alban 2012. Wedyn sôn chydig bach am yn sgil etholiad 2011, cytundeb Caeredin rhwng Alex Salmond a David Cameron. Sôn chydig bach wedyn manyliau referendwm. Nath y Llywodraeth yr Alban i gyflwyno yn y Senedd yr Alban flwyddyn diwethaf sy'n newydd cael ei pasio, a wedyn sôn chydig bach am y papur gwyn, ond dwi'n gobeithio bydd James yn sôn lot mwy am hynny yn ystod ei gyflwyniad o. Felly o ran y status quo, o ran y cyd-destun, cafodd deddf yr Alban 2012, sef deddf San Steffan, i gath o gytuniad brenhinol ar y cyntaf o Fai 2012. Mae o yn gweithredu nifer o argymhellion Comisiwn Calman, sef fersiwn yr Alban o Comisiwn Silk. Y peth mwyaf mae'n neud, dwi'n meddwl, ydy datganoli pwerau ariannol, mwy o pwerau ariannol i'r Senedd yr Alban oedd eisoes efo pwerau dros drethu incwm. Mae o'n datganoli rhagor o pwerau trethu, mwy o pwerau dros trethu tirlenwi a mwy o pwerau beddyca sy'n golygu newidiadau i'r ffordd mae'r Alban yn cael ei ariannu o 2015 ymlaen. Gan gymryd wrth gwrs y bydd yr Alban yn rhan o'r Deyrnas Unedig erbyn y pwynt yna. O ran pwerau deddfu a pwerau gweithredol ar gyfer gweinidogion, mae'n gyfyngedig. O ran dim ond pwerau dros drylliau, mae'r Senedd yn ei gael drwy'r mesur yma, ac mae gweinidogion yr Alban yn cael rhagor o bwerau yn ymwneud efo cyfyngiadau y feddygyru ac cyflymder ceir, felly dim rhyw lawer newid yng nghymhwysydd y Senedd. Wrth gwrs, cefndir i'r mesur yna oedd etholiad 2011, lle wnaeth yr SNP ennill buddigoliaeth ysgubol yn yr etholiadau datganoledig yn mis Mai 2011. Oedd yn rhoi mandat wedyn iddyn nhw gynnal referendwm ar annibyniaeth yr Alban. Yn anffodus iddyn nhw serch hynny, doedd gan y Senedd ar y pryd gynnyn nhw ddim y pwerau ar y pryd i gynnal referendwm ar ben ei hun, roedd y pwerau dros gynnal referendwm o'r fath tu allan i sgwp y setliad datganoledig. Felly, oedd hynny'n golygu bod rhaid iddyn nhw gael cytundeb rhwng y Llywodraethau. Dyna bydd digwydd yn mis Hydref 2012, sef cytundeb Caeredin, lle nath y Llywodraeth Brydeinig gytuno i ddod datganoli pwerau iddyn nhw gallu cynnal referendwm o gwbl. Oedd na'n bellu gyfyngiad yn rhan o'r cytundeb yna, felly er enghraifft oedd rhaid iddyn nhw gynnal referendwm cyn 2014. Oedd rhaid i'r referendwm fod ar sail un cwestiwn ac un cwestiwn yn unig, ac oedd rhaid i'r Comisiwn Etholiadol gael rôl yn y hefyd. Yn ogystal â hynny, oedd yr cytundeb hefyd yn galluogi i Llywodraeth yr Alban ymestyn yr franchise etholiadol i gynnwys pobl ifanc 16 i 17 oed. Ac mae'n gen i'r dyfyniad yn fara gan ein dirprwy llwyddni yma yn y Cynulliad David Melding, sydd yn pwysleisio mewn ffordd pa mor, ac i rhai ohonych chi sy'n methu gweld o, sorry, one of the most remarkable aspects of the constitutional debate in the UK is the widespread acceptance of Celtic independence as a legitimate option. A mae hynny'n pwysleisio mewn ffordd pa mor eithriadol ydy'r wladwriaeth Brydeinig yn galluogi hyn digwydd o gwbl. Mae o yn fater ofnadwy o ddadleol mewn gwledydd eraill megis Sbaen a Canada, ac mewn rhai gwledydd sydd o dan gyfundrefnau cymysliadol yn yr Almaen, ac yn Unol Daleithiau mae o'n gwbl anghyfreithlon hefyd. O ran y biliau sy'n o'r sylfaen gyfreithiol ar gyfer hyn. Cafodd hyn i cyflwyno yn y Senedd y gynharach eleni. Mae'r ail ohonyn nhw wedi cael eu pasio yn y Senedd ac yn aros i gael cyd-syniad brenhinol. Ac mae hyn sy'n cadarnhau'r manylion, felly mi fydd y referendum yn cael ei gynnal ar y 19 o Fisfedi. Y cwestiwn fydd ar y papur fydd a ddylai'r Alban fod yn wlad annibynnol. Mae o'n ymestyn sgwp y franchise i gynnwys pobl ifanc 16 i 17 oed, ac mae o'n newid rhai o'r rheolau ymgyrchu sy'n rhan o'r ddeddf Political Parties Elections and Referendums Act 2000. Yn ogystal â hynny, mae o'n datgan fod yr ymgyrch etholiadol swyddogol yn dechrau 4 mis cyn y referendum ei hun, a hynny ar y 19 o Fai 2014. Felly, dyna'r pwynt lle mae'n siŵr fydd yr ymgyrchoedd yn mynd fyny gur unwaith eto cyn yr pôl ei hun yn mis Medi. Jyst i orffen yn gyflym, sy'n eisiau licio sôn am y papur gwyn nath y Llywodraeth yr Alban i gyflwyno rhyw bythefnos yn ôl. Dogfen 670 o eiriau. Dwi heb ddarllen nhw i gyd. Ond mae'n ddiddorol yn y synnwyr bod yn pwysleisio mwy ar faterion polisi a bod o'i gweld fel hwy rhyw fath o manifesto ar gyfer SNP. Ar gyfer SNP yn hytrach na rhyw ddogfen sy'n amlinellu ag yn ateb cadarnhaol i lot o'r cwestiynau cyfansoddiadol mawr sydd ar gael. Felly, yn ogystal â sôn am aelodaeth o'r Uned Ewropeaidd, beth yn digwydd i'r Alban petai'n mynd yn annibynnol. Mae yna lot yn y fonfethiol, ymestyn gofal plant, ac o gwared y bethau am poblogaeth yn yr Alban fel bedroom tax, spare room subsidy, gan ddibynnu ar bach o'r ffens gwleidyddol â chi'n eistedd. Dau ddyfyniad yn fanna, dwi ddim wedi cynnwys yr awdur yna achos dwi'n meddwl bod o'n amlwg o bach o'r maen nhw'n dod. Felly ar un ochr, mae'r dogfen yma'n work of fiction full of meaningless assertions. Ac ar yr ochr arall, mae o'n mission statement and a prospectus for the kind of country we should be and which the government believes we can be. Felly, dwi'n hwnna'n deud y cyfan o ran pa fath o ddadleuon i ddisgwyl dros y misoedd nesaf. I orffen, mae gen i shameless plug ar gyfer papur ymchwil o'r gwasanaeth ymchwil wedi gynhyrchu yn ôl yn mis Hydref. Felly, os oes gennych chi ddiddordeb, mae o werth i chi gael golwg ar hwn.
So, we are in Scotland in what Bruce Ackerman, American legal scholar, has described as a constitutional moment. Ackerman has distinguished between what he calls constitutional and normal politics. In his mind, constitutional moments last for a number of years, and they're a higher form of politics, a much better form of politics than grubby, normal politics. And I guess one of the questions that I keep asking myself and trying to address is to what extent is Scotland's constitutional moment a higher form of politics? To what extent is it distinct from this grubby, everyday, kind of normal, inferior politics as described by Ackerman? My suggestion, let me tell you now, is that that distinction breaks down entirely when one looks at the Scottish question, and indeed there's much of our constitutional debate that's pretty grubby, very adversarial, a lot of heat and not a lot of light. But, and I want to raise this throughout the talk, underneath the surface there's something interesting going on. I have to say I've changed my view on the referendum. I had been until sometime earlier this year of the view that this referendum was going to be a nightmare, it was going to be unpleasant, it was going to be very adversarial and all the rest of it, and ultimately wouldn't resolve anything. I still take the view that it may resolve nothing, but I don't think it's entirely negative. I now take the view that there is something positive emerging in this debate, and I want to kind of allude to that. So I've become a convert to the view that this isn't quite so bad after all. Become much more, against my personality, much more optimistic only a few months ago. I've just actually edited a series of essays called After Independence that looks at the implications of this with a friend of mine, Jerry Hassan. Jerry's possibly the most optimistic man I have ever met, and it seems to have rubbed off on me. But hopefully I'll explain why my optimism has emerged, and I would say that I still have I retain my pessimistic view as well. One thing that seems to be agreed is that this referendum is very important. When we get the Prime Minister and the First Minister of Scotland agreeing that this is a historic day, a historic decision, we should at least acknowledge there is consensus on something, if not a lot. Almost all political commentators agree this is a big question, a massive debate, an important referendum. The great Tom Devine arguably or certainly describes himself as the most important historian in Scotland today, if not ever. He also has described this as an historic event. I want to pause, however, and to ask, is it? I don't think we know whether, and if so, in what way the referendum will be historic. I would argue that we will have to wait and see. It is conceivable that this will be an important event, but perhaps not quite so important as many imagine. And I'm not, in saying that, alluding to any suggestion of the outcome of the referendum. Yes or no, this may prove to be far less significant than our First Minister and Prime Minister suggest. There you go, a brave man indeed that would challenge Prime Minister Cameron and Alex Salmond on anything. But what is this debate about? It's a Scottish question or questions. I like the term Scottish question partly because, to define what I'm talking about, partly because it is a very loose notion. Imprecise and all the rest of it, and as a social scientist I'm supposed to be more precise, but frankly, to get one's head around what this debate is really about, one has to have an open mind. This is not simply a constitutional debate in the narrow sense. It clearly is the case that the referendum question is focused on a clear constitutional question: should Scotland become an independent country or not? But there is much more going on in the background. My argument is that there are four interconnected sets of questions and issues. Failure to acknowledge each of these four and the relationships, the dynamic and changing relationships, will lead you to all sorts of mistaken conclusions. One has to get a head around each of these. The constitutional question is clearly important. National identity is important. My own view on national identity is that it has become far less important than it was in the past. Perhaps it never was quite so important. For me, I think the question about national identity is less whether it is the driver of change or a manifestation of changes in attitudes on a range of other issues, including, frankly, everyday public policy issues, the kind of society that we want to have in Scotland. The party political system, the fact that in Scotland we've only got one Tory MP at Westminster, the fact that in much of our political debate the Tories remain seen by a large proportion of the Scottish electorate as alien. Unfair, perhaps, but that is how they are still perceived. That feeds into this constitutional debate. If everyday party politics, everyday public policy issues were taken out of it, it was simply about national identity, I doubt whether we would be having a referendum next September on Scottish independence. So it is the interaction of these elements that gives rise to this Scottish question. As I say, it's dynamic, it's changing, it will continue to change well into the future. And it's one of the reasons why I'm sceptical, frankly, as to the likelihood that the referendum will resolve, finally, once and for all, historically, the Scottish question. It can't, it won't, is my suggestion. However, we do, of course, have a referendum. Whatever I may have thought or now think about it, there is a referendum. And it's an interesting referendum. But I think it's worth bearing in mind the nature of political debate in the UK. Because while in Scotland we're fond of saying that we're different, we're distinct, in one crucial respect, Scottish politics is very, very British. It is highly adversarial. It is very much a debate in which one proponent puts forward a proposition and its opponents attack it. There is very little scope, as has been evident in the referendum so far, for any party to this debate to concede anything. Hence the two quotations that you used at the end. Either the white paper is seen as providing answers and a great blueprint for a better Scotland, or it doesn't even begin to address the questions that need addressed. There is just simply no scope for any compromise on each side. Now, recently read this book, Gutman and Thompson's book, came out last year, which is not about Scottish politics or indeed British politics, it's an American politics book, but I found it very, very interesting and revealing. The essence of that book is that in American politics, which I think equally applies in the UK and certainly applies to the Scottish referendum, you have competing mindsets. On the one hand, during a campaign, whether it's a referendum or indeed an election, you have a campaign mindset which will not allow for any kind of compromise, but then you need to have a different kind of mindset when it comes to governing, in which you have respect for your opponents, in which compromise is essential, in which a very different type of politics needs to emerge. The argument of the book is that American politics actually is struggling to get into a governing mindset, that the politicians there struggle to get into it. The question is whether on the other side of the referendum we can move from the highly adversarial, heated debate into a spirit of compromise in which discussions can take place. I look at the white paper and what I see is a statement from the Scottish Government as to what it would like to happen on the other side of the referendum. It is a negotiating position at the outset. It can be only that if only that. It clearly cannot be the last word on the issue of the kind of Scotland, the constitutional status, and so much else that will emerge in the event of a yes vote. The other party to this that needs to engage with this is the UK government. And understandably, UK government is refusing to say what its negotiating position would be. What they are saying is that, no, we wouldn't allow Scotland to do X, Y, and Z. The only thing we know is that what they may say on one side of the referendum will be very different from the other side. Beyond that, we don't know what they would actually do. So there will be negotiations, there will be tricky negotiations, there will be discussions on the other side of the referendum, but ultimately we just don't know what will happen. UK government will complain, Better Together complain, that yes isn't saying what would actually happen, yes can't say exactly what would happen. Neither side is likely to move on this. Frankly, to expect them to do so is a wee bit naive. It would be nice if we had new politics and people could compromise in advance, but frankly that's not going to happen, and nor should we really expect it to happen. The other aspect of the debate, again drawing on another academic piece of work which says nothing about Scotland but from which I can take much, is Chris Hood's book The Blame Game. What we have here in Scotland, as much as anything in this referendum, is not just a kind of an attempt to put forward a positive vision, there's some of that for sure in the white paper, but also implicitly a blame game. Staying in the union leads to X, Y, and Z, leaving the union leads to all sorts of awful things happening. So it's really a blame game as much as anything else. That aligned with the kind of notion of adversarial politics makes it very difficult, I think, for the public to make sense of what's going on. This is particularly evident in our media. From the Financial Times, The Economist, it's very difficult to get anything sensible, even from papers such as this. This is a wonderful headline from The Economist from April 2012. Skintland, that's what Scotland will become in the event of independence. And over-the-top attacks, and we're getting it from both sides. Up here, this one's actually moving, which is particularly scary. This is a programme that I'd never heard about until very recently. I think it was about a week or two ago. A daytime television programme called The Right Stuff. Who has heard of it? Put your heads down in shame if you've heard of it. This was a debate on Scottish independence. I'm told this woman, not that one, well maybe her as well, but the other one, was well, all of them were giving their views on it, and it was just awful beyond belief. I have to say, I really feel for the Scottish electorate. Well, I don't really, if you're sitting watching daytime TV, I'm not sure about something that I have for you. But that's the kind of stuff that we're contending with in trying to have a serious debate. In other words, the public debate is highly adversarial, very difficult to see beyond that. The bottom picture is the kind of thing that we're going to see a lot more of. This is our Deputy First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, with Alistair Carmichael, recently appointed Scottish Secretary, debating on Scottish television the issue of independence. We were told that Mr Carmichael had replaced Mr Moore as Scottish Secretary because there was a need for a bruiser. What we hadn't realised until this debate is that he's known as the bruiser because he bruises easily. This is possibly a unique event because it was a completely devastating debate from Mr Carmichael's point of view. And it's one of the reasons, I think, some of the ways in which the Deputy First Minister, who for my money, for what it's worth, is more impressive than the First Minister in Scotland, I think really demolished him, and I think there's a fear that that may kick in during the course of next year. I'm not convinced, but that is certainly often said. The more important point is highly adversarial. You can watch them if you like blood sports, but you will learn very little substantively about what will happen. So that's where I was at the beginning of this year, deeply depressed, thinking this is the way forward, this is going to be awful, please don't make me watch daytime TV. But let me now explain why my view has changed, and let me have a look at some of the key issues. I said a moment ago that the key point about this referendum and the Scottish question is it's not just a constitutional question, there's much more besides everyday public policy. And it strikes me that there are a kind of a number of key points to the referendum. In the debate, there are certain issues that are core to the debate, and I'll come on to those in a moment. These are the areas which we've heard a great deal about, which the white paper talks about, which the campaign groups talk about, highly adversarial stuff in that. But there's also a whole series of issues affecting everyday public policies that are not part of the debate. It's worth reminding ourselves that actually we get on with our lives in Scotland. We're not all obsessed with the referendum. I got into terrible trouble from both sides on the evening that the white paper was published, because I went on television and said that I'm thinking more about Christmas than this white paper. I did a whole day of it. I was jaded by the end of the day, but actually making a serious point. The public is thinking about everyday other issues. Over the course of the summer, I was interviewing senior officials in local government, health boards, chief constable, a whole range of people. And I was struck by how many people said to me they're getting on with their everyday work, delivering services across Scotland, aware that the referendum's taking place, but it's hardly impinging on their daily lives. How many of those then went on to say, unprovoked by me, that they were delighted that this was the case, and long may it continue. So an awful lot is going on, insulated from this debate, and many people are very happy that it should continue to be so. However, I think for me, the interesting sets of issues, and I'll say more about these shortly, are those that are insinuating themselves into the debate, who are moving from being insulated across here, taking nothing to do with it, issues that I'll talk about in a moment to give an illustration, that are saying, well, this referendum's taking place, how can we take advantage of this debate? And of course there are also spillover effects. The referendum will have implications both within Scotland and I think particularly for places like Wales. I guess one of the questions I would pose is, where would Wales fit into this diagram? It's not going to be core to the debate, frankly, much as you might wish it to be. Wales is not, frankly, core to the debate. People in Scotland don't know. The First Minister of Wales was up in Scotland. I was in the audience. I knew just about everybody in the audience. This tiny audience hardly got covered in the press. Most people in Scotland have never heard of your First Minister, and that is not a statement on your First Minister, no matter who it was. If Jesus Christ became First Minister of Wales, I doubt the Scots would know or care, sadly. Sadly. It is simply not the case you're going to be core to this debate. Just the question is, will simply the Welsh debate be completely insulated and separate from it? Can you continue to have a debate and look at more power, silk and so on and so forth, apart from this debate? Or can you insinuate yourselves into this debate without getting too close to the very hot centre? Or are you just simply going to have to deal with the effects, the spillover effects of this referendum? So what are the kind of core issues? I'll quickly go through these. It's a great debate, as ever. Change versus status quo is always hope versus fear. Well, I can't recall a debate in Scottish politics which has been so much about hope versus fear. Defence and so on and so forth. You've touched on this, so I'll rush through this. These are the kind of issues that are core to the debate. But there's much more to Scottish politics and this debate. The kind of public policy challenges that confront Scotland. We've got major demographic challenges, an ageing population, a very unhealthy population, which we've had for a very long time. Our record in public health is appalling. Only Wales comes close to it, frankly, in that respect. Our economy, Well, in recent years we've been doing much better in terms of economic growth. If we believe economic growth to be important, not everybody does, but we clearly have not had a great record there. So we've got some real challenges in terms of the economy. In terms of the environment, interesting to consider the economy, the challenges of the economic growth and how we manage that with ensuring we've got sustainable development, that we respect for future generations, we respect the environment in which we live. I think that's a major tension actually in the white paper. I think there are serious tensions between what the Scottish Government is proposing in terms of developing the economy and managing our environment. Financial, a very long, hard financial winter. I've already alluded to that. Only about a third of the cuts have been imposed. And regardless of what happens next year in the referendum, cuts are coming to Scotland, regardless of what happens in the referendum. And we're going to have to become much more adept in delivering services with far fewer resources in the future. I have to say, incidentally, it came out of a discussion I was just having with a journalist before coming along here this morning. I think one of the things that we've had a problem with in Scotland, and I suspect also in Wales, is that for too long we have measured our success in terms of how much money we've won out of London rather than how much we can change our countries. We in Scotland have got an appalling health record, but we have poured money into health. To what effect? That is an important question that needs to be addressed and is beginning to be addressed, it has to be said. So we've got all of these in an institutional landscape. My goodness, are we overgoverned, some would suggest. We've got all these different institutions. We have 32 local authorities, 23 NHS bodies, 8 police forces, 20 universities, 43 colleges, and over 1,000 other public bodies, according to a very important, very sobering document, the Independent Budget Review report that came out in July 2010. I think one of the most important documents on Scottish government that's been published in decades, hardly reported in Scottish media. Very sobering, very frightening in some respects. In fairness, some things have changed. We no longer have 8 police forces. We've nationalised our police force. That's one change. There's been big changes in the college sector. 43 colleges, that's no longer quite the case. It's much, much more about mergers. I keep warning the universities, they're coming for us soon. Get ready for it. So these are big challenges over the next few years, and there have been attempts to deal with this. I have to put in a plug for the Christie Commission, partly because I was a member of the Commission. We try to address some of these questions. Now, if you asked me a year ago where I would want to be in terms of Christie, we came out with a report that was published in, I think it was July 2011, recommending 4 key principles or pillars that needed to be addressed in Scotland, regardless of the constitutional status. We needed to empower people in communities, much more than we've done in the past. In Scotland, we have a tendency to see the state as delivering for people, to people, rather than enabling people to do things for themselves. We need a lot more partnership across public services, integrating provision of services, to not just because it saves money, because it makes a better outcome at the end. We need to have a greater shift in our resources and our thinking to prevent negative outcomes. I think the phrase that I often use is something that I heard a former health minister once say. We're good at putting bodies back together that have fallen off the cliff. We're hopeless at preventing them falling off the cliff in the first place. Scotland, Wales, and many other parts of the UK, I think, have a need to address that kind of issue. And we need greater efficiency. Now, if you'd asked me at the beginning of the year, I would have said that the tragedy is that as far as those issues are concerned, that we were really not going to have an opportunity to develop these debates. And at the very least, I would want to have these insulated, separate from the constitutional debate. Interesting that this has not been quite happening. There have been changes. Although, as I said a moment ago, many people in the public sector are quite delighted that they could be insulated from it. There has been an attempt to insinuate some of these issues I've just been talking about into the constitutional debate. And I want to give 2 examples. There are many, many examples. The 2 I've chosen are partly because I've been involved in both in some way, shape or form. The end of last year, Scottish Refugee Council decided it really needed to look at this referendum but not take sides. And I, along with some other colleagues, contributed to a report that was produced in January of this year looking at a good refugee policy for Scotland. The thinking behind this initiative was that there was a need to take advantage of a current debate, the referendum, on Scottish independence, which clearly would raise questions about citizenship, and to ask a key set of questions: what is a good policy as far as refugees and asylums are concerned? To put forward an image of what a good policy would be, and to challenge both sides. What would we expect to see change at a UK level in the event of a no vote? What would we like to see a Scottish Government do in the event of a yes vote? It didn't attract, it has to be said, go into the streets of Glasgow. You will not find many people have heard of this report or heard of the Scottish Refugee Council. But what has happened is that officials in the Scottish Government became well aware of it, and it has influenced in a minor way their kind of thinking. So that is an example of kind of insinuating an important matter into these debates. I have to say, I think it's one of the most important matters if we're looking at issues of citizenship. Those who have no citizenship, those who are absolutely lost, forlorn and forgotten, will always be a real test of any polity. The other initiative I want to mention that's insinuated itself into this debate is the Our Islands Are Our Futures debate. Orkney, Shetland and the Western Isles have come together to form a campaign, this campaign arguing for greater autonomy, arguing for a great deal of things, so many of which I'm not sure I would support, but nonetheless saying we're not taking sides so much in this debate, but we want to know where our islands will fit in the future. What are you going to give to us? As a consequence of this initiative, UK government has met with the island leaders and is discussing possible changes in the future, because there are many things that the islands want that are currently held by Westminster. Crown Estates being a key issue for anyone who's from an island community or from a coastal community will be well aware of the importance of the Crown Estates. And the Scottish Government has set up a working party. Now, clearly the danger with both of these initiatives is that they are insinuating into the periphery of the debate. If they become central to the debate, core to the debate, they get into very difficult, dangerous, adversarial territory that they want to keep out of. So it's a really challenging issue in terms of how this is done. So what about Wales? How might Wales move forward? The term that I put up here again and again is asymmetry. I think asymmetry is the key. The UK is asymmetrical. And I think any attempt to impose symmetry across the UK would be both disastrous and it would fail. It just simply would not work. The beauty, the strength of the United Kingdom is its asymmetry. But does asymmetry have to mean incoherence? Does asymmetry mean there are no spillover effects? Quite clearly, asymmetry is currently meaning incoherence, but equally there are spillover effects. And I think the great challenge for people in Wales is to work out how to insinuate your interests into this debate, which is highly adversarial, in which people in Scotland don't care about Wales, and people in London and Whitehall, frankly, don't care either to any great extent. How do you insinuate yourself into that debate? A number of different possibilities. You mentioned your First Minister came up to speak, and that was interesting. What he put forward was, I think, a very interesting set of propositions. His vision of a very different United Kingdom is certainly worth looking at and needs to be debated. I think some of his propositions are not so easy to take seriously, frankly, and I can see why he put them forward. The idea that Wales would veto a Scottish membership of the pound. The fact is that in no future scenario could I imagine London paying too much attention to Wales. If Wales is saying what they want them to say, well and good, but the notion of having a veto or any major say is a wee bit unrealistic at the moment. Perhaps in the future, but I have to say I doubt it, that may come. But it is important, I think, to spell out and to work out where Wales can sit on the other side of the referendum and ensure that the Welsh voice is not heard. What he has talked about essentially is a very different kind of United Kingdom, and his mindset is a much more federal mindset, which is entirely absent still in the centre of our polity in the United Kingdom. So all power to him in that respect. Another issue that's arisen in the debates here in Wales, and perhaps ahead of other parts of the United Kingdom, which is beginning to pick up support. I nearly said a head of steam, but that's far too strong. But there's some support and there's some potential. It's the notion of a constitutional convention. It's interesting the white paper talks about a Scottish constitutional convention in the event of a yes vote and outlines the kind of things it would like to see addressed. And I'll come back to that shortly. But if there's a no vote, there are those, including some in Scotland, here in Wales, and indeed in the House of Commons, who've raised the possibility of a constitutional convention. That may be a route into the debate for people in Wales. Let me now go through some of the scenarios. What happens if yes wins? Well, I suspect there'll be a rebalancing and reconstitution of the UK. But I suspect there will be more continuity than change. Will it be pragmatic adaptation or critical juncture? My own view is there'll be pragmatic adaptation. That's the British way of doing things, and I've every reason to believe that that would continue to be the case. Barnett might actually end. The end of Barnett, hooray, say people in Wales. Why do I think that's likely? Because the only main impediment in the way of getting rid of Wales will have gone, i.e. Scotland. Scotland is the major impediment, if not the only impediment, in the way of Barnett. But can I also stress that we shouldn't just focus on Barnett and public spending for the reasons I gave earlier. Let's not measure success by the amount of money that comes out of Whitehall. By all means, all power to you. I think you do deserve more than you're getting under Barnett. I think Scotland is more favourably treated than it deserves. Not many Scots will say that, but I'm quite happy to say it. But it must go beyond just counting the money and thinking you've got success because you've got a reformed Barnett. What you do is important. Don't waste the money, as both Scotland and Wales, I would argue, have done. Smaller House of Commons. What about Welsh representation in the smaller House of Commons? Very interesting. Frankly, it won't make a blind bit of difference, really, in terms of the Scottish MPs being removed. That doesn't mean to say that we should be having a debate, or you, because I'll be excluded from this debate, I suspect, or in terms of representation in the House of Commons. I can't help thinking that a reform of the Commons, voting systems will come back onto the agenda at some stage in the future. Reduced competition. Yeah, who's getting that steel mill? We don't debate these now, but we did in the past. Well, who's got most muscle is really often the case. Who's got access to the Prime Minister? That will be reduced, but it also means a loss of an ally. If no wins, well, it depends on how big a majority the no vote is. My own view on that is that the most likely scenario is that if no wins with a large majority, there will be pressure in London to reform Barnett. There will be a sense, well, the Scots have had their chance, they've blown it, we don't have to pay attention. That's certainly what happened in 1979. It's very interesting going through the Thatcher papers in the archives at Churchill College in Cambridge. That was the attitude. I'm not convinced, however, it will be the attitude of Mr Cameron. Mr Cameron is not Margaret Thatcher. History has taught him lessons. I think there will be greater sensitivity. And so it could be the case that even if there's a massive no vote, London might feel a wee bit wary of Scotland, be magnanimous towards it, and they won't want to be seen, at least, to be taking resource away. I have to say, I also think the debate will not be over. It's very interesting talking again about the archives. I'm looking recently at some of the archives in the Public Record Office at Kew, coming across some of the debates from the 70s. Back then, the UK government considered a referendum on Scottish independence. And one of the main reasons they decided not to have it, it's not because they thought they would lose, they were convinced they would win, but they said it won't make a blind bit of difference. If there's a yes vote for independence of 30%, it most certainly will mean that independence remains a big live issue. So unless there's an enormous vote against independence, this issue won't go away. I think it was captured brilliantly in this quotation from Neil Acheson, who'd spent 5 years covering Scottish politics up to 1979, wrote his final article in The Scotsman in autumn of 1979. The quote, I won't go through it, sufficiently captures his reasons then that I think would be similar to now as to why the issue will not die. If no wins by a slim majority, there'll be a great battle over how to interpret it. There'll be an enormous focus on London-Scottish relations and what we should do with Scotland. That, in a way, is going to be really challenging for Wales to get into that debate. So you'd have to contribute something that helps either or both sides in that debate. But the debate will continue. The debate will continue. I love this cartoon, and it's one that I keep reminding people on the no side who seem to think they're going to win this and that will be the end of history, Scottish style. Point is, knowing some of the people who are involved in this campaign on the yes side, they're not going to give up. they'll accept the result, but the notion they're going to say that's it, it's over, it ain't going to happen like that. This debate will continue well into the future, which leads me to the notion of a convention. Let me just say briefly what kind of convention is established, assuming that is the way forward, and there does seem to be a growing consensus around convention, will be important. How it's constituted, who makes up the convention, the remit of the convention, the conduct of the convention will be hugely important. Here's a couple of conventions up here. The American Convention, Philadelphia, late 18th century. Drew up that wonderful document, the American Constitution, a very short document. Why is it short? Well, look at the membership. They agreed on just about everything anyway. And actually the remit of the convention, highly limited. White, rich men getting around a table in private, oh absolutely, we don't know what was actually going on because of Madison's notes. But in private doing that, I think that there was never any doubt that we're going to debate some of the things that are now in modern constitutional conventions. This is the Scottish Constitutional Convention, a very different type of institution. My suggestion is if there's to be a constitutional convention, it must be much more like that, and certainly not like that. The more expansive the membership, the more expansive the remit, the more difficult it will be for the powers that be to control that convention. How often should we debate the Constitution? Well, there's different debates on that. Jefferson, of course, argued it should be every 19 years. We should dispense with the Constitution and start fresh each generation. James Madison took the view you can't do that. He was one of those in favour of making sure the Constitution was fixed in time. My guess is that actually on this one Jefferson's going to prove to be correct, as indeed has been the case with most constitutions, the American Constitution notwithstanding. I actually think, regardless of the outcome of the referendum, we're in a period of never-endings. If there's a no vote, we're likely to have an EU referendum, and if we're to have more powers in Scotland, no one's raised this yet, but does it mean we have to have a referendum on more powers? Why is it that you in Wales have to have a referendum on perhaps less more powers, if that's the right phrase, than we in Scotland are being promised, but we won't have to have a referendum other than the one in which we've rejected independence? Is that logical? Not to me. So I think there will be pressure for another referendum. And who knows? I suspect we'll have another referendum on independence even if there's no vote. 2029, I think, at the very, very latest. If there's a yes vote, well, the Scottish Government is committed to a constitutional convention and a referendum on that. And the likelihood is in Scotland we'll have lots of referendums because I think any convention, whether it's UK or Scottish, will write a referendum clause into its written constitution. So let me conclude. And I want to conclude by quoting Seller and Yeatman, that great work of British history, 1066 and all that. Wonderful work. Scottish question seems to me to be a bit like the Irish question as they outlined it. Gladstone spent his declining years trying to guess the answer to the Irish question. Unfortunately, whenever he was getting warm, the Irish secretly changed the question. The Scottish question will continue to evolve, change, it won't be pinned down. Thanks.